My people, picture this. Every few months, a presidential jet from an African nation lands in Washington, D.C. Another handshake, another press statement about partnership and shared values. But here's the truth no one tells you. These trips are not just about diplomacy. They are about a system built to reward compliance and punish those who resist. And African leaders, many are more than willing to play along. We all see these visits. And friends, the real question is, why does this pattern never change? Why are African leaders still making pilgrimages to Washington, D.C., while American presidents visit Africa rarely and often symbolically? The truth isn't flattering. In fact, it's worse than most people think. Greetings and welcome. I'm Dr. Christie Agawu. If you're new here, we do deep investigations into African development issues, post-colonial systems, and the global power structures that keep our continent wealthy in resources but poor in outcomes. And if you've been rocking with me, you know how we do it, and I thank you. If these insights matter to you, you're home. Subscribe and share, because this conversation is long overdue. So why do African governments keep rushing off to America? The simple answer is because the world is designed for them to do so. But that's only half the story. The other half requires honesty and accountability from us. Yes, the international system was built to create dependency. In 1944, while Africa was still under colonial rule, Western powers met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in America to design the post-war economic order. They created the IMF, they created the World Bank, and a year later came the United Nations. Africans, of course, were not invited. These institutions were not neutral. They were designed around Western priorities, except they wired their interests into the global economy that assigned Africa a permanent role: extraction, not production; raw materials, not value addition. And here's the part that is almost never mentioned when Europe's post-war miracle is celebrated. While the United States used Marshall Plan grants to build Europe, gaining enormous political and strategic leverage in the process, European colonial powers were simultaneously draining Africa to finance that recovery. The Marshall Plan funding alone was not enough. Substantial, but not enough. Europe rebuilt itself with Congolese uranium, with West African cocoa and palm oil, with gold, with diamonds and copper pulled from African soil and African labor. And you know how they did it? Well, colonial administrations either directly extracted raw materials or oversaw extraction by their national companies. Those resources were then sold on the global markets for hard currency, the dollars. Europe desperately needed to rebuild, to industrialize, and to subsidize. And where did the money go? Not to Africa, not towards an industrial base, no meaningful infrastructure. Of course, it went to London, to Paris, to Brussels. And in return, Africa received nothing. Africa was not only excluded from the post-war system, it was used to rebuild the very powers that had colonized it. Yep, all of this is true. But here's the other truth, that African leadership decisions have helped maintain and are complicit in that dependency long after independence. Today, we're unpacking both sides of the truth. The external architecture of power and the internal domestic failures that keep Africa dependent. No emotional slogans, no easy villains, just reality, uncomfortable but necessary and overdue. So my people, let us begin. First, let's be clear about something. America is not just another country, it is a gatekeeper. When an African leader boards a plane to Washington, it's not because power is shared there, no. It's because power is concentrated there. Decisions affecting African economies, security arrangements, and diplomatic standing are shaped in that space. They're going there not to decide, they're going there to be assessed. They go seeking diplomatic cover at the United Nations, where American backing can determine legitimacy or isolation. They go to reassure American corporations not to invest in Africa's development, but to signal that their countries remain safe environments for extraction. They go because access to global finance is filtered through the IMF and the World Bank, institutions in which the United States holds disproportionate power. They go because even their own regional security narratives, terrorism, stability, intervention, are framed through US military and intelligence priorities. They go because the United Nations system, especially the Security Council, still operates on veto power rather than democratic representation. And they go because American corporations sit at the center of global supply chains that determine who extracts, who processes, and who profits. This architecture of compliance was not accidental. It was built before Africa had a seat at the table. So African leaders go, as the saying in Ghana puts it, to mark their register, to say, present, sir. See, I showed up. See, I voted with you on the issues that matter to you. See, I play by your rules. And then inevitably, we take a photograph together. Friends, that is why it was remarkable, refreshingly so, though perhaps long overdue, that at the most recent United Nations General Assembly, some African heads of state publicly challenged the structure itself, demanding fair representation and a seat at the decision-making table.
Consider Africa's immense untapped potential in clean energy resources. Harnessing this potential is critical not only for the continent's economic growth and social resilience, but also for global priorities like accelerating the energy transition, combating climate change, and diversifying supply chains.
We must recalibrate the delicate balance between our roles as sovereign governments and our duties as collective partners to renew multilateralism in a world that has evolved far beyond what it was in 1945.
We cannot and should not accept that members of this organization continue willfully to violate without consequence the charter that we have all agreed to uphold.
Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African.
Whether that protest becomes policy, whether the bark will finally have bite, remains to be seen. But we have to note that it is a good start. And this is why independence, when it came in the 1960s, was always incomplete. African nations inherited the symbols of sovereignty, flags, anthems, constitutions, but not sovereignty itself. The global economic architecture had already been built. The rules were written, the arbiters selected, and the outcomes, in many ways, predetermined. Kwame Nkrumah saw this early. In his book, Neo-colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, he wasn't simply writing theory. He was issuing a warning. He argued that power would no longer arrive through armies and direct rule, but through debt, through trade, currency control, and political manipulation disguised as partnership. And when that book hit Western capitals, it didn't provoke only academic debate, it provoked alarm, because Kwame Nkrumah was naming a system many hoped Africans would never recognize. He was describing domination without occupation, control without presence, chains you could not see, but you could not escape. This post-war global order, anchored in American hegemony, was designed to guarantee two outcomes. First, Western control over global capital. Second, African dependence on external approval, credit, and legitimacy. So, my people, when you see African presidents lining up for White House photo opportunities, understand this. They are not simply engaging in diplomacy. They are operating within a system that predates them, one that determines who gets access, who gets punished, and who is allowed to develop on whose terms. But this is where the conversation has to shift, my people, and where it becomes uncomfortable. Because while this system was designed to constrain African power, other nations have found ways to rise within it. China, the People's Republic of China, industrialized within this system. South Korea did it too. It had been colonized by Japan and devastated by war. Singapore did it. Singapore had no natural resources. Vietnam is doing it now. Vietnam too was brutally colonized, experienced decades of war. And Botswana, on our very own continent, one of the poorest countries, had independence. It leveraged the same order more effectively than most. Which brings us to the question we often avoid: why hasn't Africa? True accountability, my people, requires us to examine what African leaders have done or failed to do with the sovereignty we do have. Because Africa possesses what every nation competing for power wants. We have the minerals, we have the population, we have vast agricultural capacity, we have a continental market of more than 1.4 billion people. So why are we still exporting raw materials and importing the finished products made from them? Why is the Democratic Republic of Congo, say, home to over half the world's cobalt, not the center of battery manufacturing? Why do we continue to negotiate separately as small and vulnerable states instead of collectively as a continental bloc? And here's the most difficult truth of all. Too many African leaders don't govern to build sovereignty. It appears they govern to manage dependence. Dependence is convenient. It concentrates power, replaces public accountability with foreign approval, and turns development into a promise that's always postponed. One IMF call is easier than facing your own people, than taxing, than building a domestic social contract, than explaining hard choices to citizens who actually bear the cost. And in that space, between dependence and delay, elites, they loot, they bleed their nations like there's no tomorrow. So why do African presidents keep flying to Washington, D.C.? Because the global system was built to make that flight necessary. To be fair, corruption isn't everything, but it explains far more than we are willing to admit. When billions leave the continent through illicit financial flows, when public wealth is quietly parked in foreign banks, that is not the IMF doing that. When billions get looted from national budgets, it is not the IMF. It is internal betrayal, deliberate, structural, and generational. External pressure is real, true that. But internal failure, it enables it and multiplies it. And until we are willing to confront both, we will continue to misdiagnose the problem, blame the wrong forces, and reproduce the same outcomes. Here is the reality, and it is not complicated. If Africa negotiated as a bloc, processed its own minerals, controlled its food systems, not food security, but food sovereignty, built predictable institutions, and acted collectively, Washington, D.C. would not be summoning African presidents. Washington, D.C. would be coming to Africa. Because Africa already holds extraordinary leverage. It controls a vast share of the world's strategic resources. It has gold, it has cobalt, platinum group metals, chromium, manganese, lithium, name them. The minerals that power smartphones, electric vehicles, weapon systems, and the so-called green transition. Africa also controls the majority of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. Africa could feed itself and much of the world if it pursued food sovereignty rather than permanent import dependence. And Africa has the youngest workforce on earth and a rapidly expanding consumer market. This is not a burden, this is the bargaining power. In Ghana, President John Mahama's push for the gold board, an attempt to centralize gold purchasing, curb smuggling and process and retain more value locally, signaled a quiet but significant shift from extraction toward control. His government has also banned export of raw shea nuts starting 2026, ensuring value addition in Ghana, not abroad. Across West Africa's shea belt, Burkina Faso, Mali, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire have also banned or restricted shea nut exports in the last 2 years. Nigeria, which produces 40% of the world's shea supply but captures only 1% of the 3 billion global shea market, announced its own ban in August 2025. The message is clear. We'll produce the nuts, we'll process them too. No more exporting raw materials only to buy back finished products at marked up prices. These are modest steps, but they point in a dangerous direction. Dangerous not for Africans, but for systems built on cheap access and weak regulation. In the Sahel, the shift has been far more explicit. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have rejected the old security and economic arrangements outright. They have expelled French troops. They've challenged external military presence and begun renegotiating the terms under which their resources are accessed. These governments are not perfect, but their message is unmistakable. Sovereignty is no longer negotiable. History tells us what happens when leaders begin to recognize this, even tentatively. The response is immediate. Kwame Nkrumah understood this and was overthrown. Patrice Lumumba understood it and was killed. Thomas Sankara rejected IMF prescriptions and built self-reliance, tried to do it. He called IMF and the World Bank officials technical assassins. He was assassinated. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency to weaken dollar dominance, and Libya was destroyed. Almost every African leader who has seriously pursued economic sovereignty has faced destabilization, coups, sanctions, isolation, or death. Resistance has consequences, but submission does too. And the consequences of submission is what Africa is living with today. But we are in a different era. The youth are no longer taking it lying down. They want to live good lives too, and they deserve it. Take Rwanda under President Paul Kagame. Whatever one thinks of his authoritarianism, it demonstrates something important. When institutions are built, when discipline is enforced, when systems matter more than personalities, outcomes change. Leaders with steely backs, unwavering honesty, and true commitment to Africa, that's what the continent needs. But here's a harder truth. African leadership has largely failed to build the systems that would make it optional. And frankly, many don't seem to care. They think about visas for their children, per diems and allowances, royal treatments abroad, and impunity at home, public money recycled to friends and family, prestige without accountability, power without consequences. I've discussed John Perkins' economic 8-man framework before, how compliant leaders are rewarded with loans, legitimacy, visas, and access, while those who resist face coups, assassinations, or economic warfare. If you missed that episode, do go watch it. Mr. Sam Kutesa, a former Ugandan foreign affairs minister, when he was diagnosed with throat cancer, he didn't stay in Kampala. He flew to Germany and spent 6 months receiving world-class treatment. He returned, healed, and he built a church to thank God. Not a cancer ward, not a treatment center, not a research institute, a church. He's not alone. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo made a personal promise to God to build a national cathedral with private funds if he won the elections. He won and dug up a hole costing over $50 million of taxpayers' money. Today, the project is estimated to be $400 million. Meanwhile, hospitals lack beds. Cancer patients are referred abroad, and families crowd fundraising platforms begging for treatment money. That same money could have built 3 of President Akufo-Addo's Agenda 1.1 hospitals. The projected cost of the cathedral, $400 million, could have built 23 of them. Think about that. Let that sink in. Dependency isn't just enforced, it's maintained. So you see, many African leaders are comfortable. It's like, why rock the boat when all you care about is siphoning money? My people, Africa is rich, but Africans are not. And the first step in dismantling this is honesty, not just about colonialism, but about governance, not just about the West, but about us. Until then, the jets will keep flying zip, 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 zip to Washington, D.C., and the imbalance will remain. So, my friends, if this challenged you, good. It means this is your home. Share it, discuss it, push it. Subscribe if you're ready for content that refutes easy answers. And keep sharing and commenting till the next time. We're just getting started.